facilitated this important visit, important for me, and for providing all kinds of cooperation, including in security sense. It's very much appreciated, and I hope for such good cooperation with the authorities also in the future. I came to Ethiopia for one key reason. For the fact that the humanitarian needs in this country have reached record levels. This is due to many factors, and you know them all. Among the key factors that contribute to this record humanitarian needs are the following. First, there are refugees that Ethiopia generously hosts from a number of neighboring countries, and whose number is close to 1 million. Then there are millions of internally displaced persons due to the conflict and intercommunal tensions within the country, but also due to some other reasons. Then there is historic drought, especially in the south and southeastern part of the country, which has increased dramatically the food insecurity for millions of people, especially in the Somali regional state. I tried to cover some of these key challenges to the city of Kode, where I could witness the devastating consequences of this historic drought that occurred now after 4 failed rainy seasons. It was heartbreaking to see malnourished children. It was heartbreaking to see families who lost their livestock due to drought, and with that, their livelihoods. It was heartbreaking to see the sea of makeshift habitations in IDP site near Gold. And we discussed with the authorities of the regional states how we can help. And we agreed that yes, as long as our emergency aid in the form of humanitarian assistance is needed, it will be there. But we also agreed that humanitarian aid alone is not a solution. That we need to look at longer-term sustainable solutions, those that will address the root causes of such humanitarian crisis as is now unfolding due to the drought in South and Southeast. So we need to find ways to increase resilience of population, to increase the options that they have for their livelihoods, so as not to be vulnerable to the recurrent phenomenon like droughts. On the second day, today, I traveled to the north, to Mekelle, where we noted important improvements when it comes to the provision of some basic humanitarian aid. I noted with pleasure the fact that the number of trucks bringing humanitarian aid, mostly food assistance, essential food assistance, has now almost reached the levels necessary to cover basic humanitarian needs of the people in Tigray. And we welcome that, and I conveyed this to the authorities here in Addis Ababa. But more needs to be done. More needs to be done. Much of the blockade still remains. There is a need to lift restrictions, especially on the provision of fuel, on cash transactions, and so on. Fuel is needed. More fuel is needed because without it, even this food assistance that comes to Mekele cannot reach rural areas where the needs are highest. So now we have a situation where warehouses, humanitarian warehouses in Mekele are full, but people out there on the countryside are still hungry. So fuel is critical. Fuel is also critical for the hospitals. I visited the Ida Referral Hospital, which is the biggest hospital, as you know, and they lack fuel to run to power generators once there are electricity cuts, which happens very often. And you know what happens when life-saving machines do not operate because there is no electricity and there is no fuel for generators. This places medical staff into a position where they cannot help people, cannot save their lives because of banalities like lack of fuel. Cash is also needed. The cash restrictions need to be lifted, or at least significantly increased. The cash that is nowadays allowed into the region is not even sufficient for salaries to be paid to the employees, local employees of international humanitarian organizations, let alone the staff of hospital, for instance, who has been going to work for 1 year without getting salary. And this brings me to the next point. Essential services also have to be restored. By essential services, I mean electricity, for the reasons that I mentioned, because the lack of electricity, on one hand, increases humanitarian needs, and on the other hand, hampers the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Electricity has to be restored. That should be an easy one. You cannot shoot with electricity. Second, banking system needs to be restored also. A lot of people have substantial savings. A lot of people in today have substantial savings in the banks, but they cannot access those savings. And then that means that they depend entirely on handouts from the international community. Also, telecommunications and internet need to be restored because the lack of these seriously hampers the provision of humanitarian aid. So this is what we have in mind when we say more needs to be done. While we welcome the improvement that are there, we still point to the additional measures that need to be taken and that would allow ultimately full normalization of relations between the European Union and Ethiopia, which we wish to have. I'm now ready for the questions.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is David from Reuters. I just have a very quick one question. So you met with Deputy Prime Minister Demeqe Mekonnen, also President of Tigray region, Dr. Debretsion. So what was your impression? Do you think both parties will have, a negotiated ceasefire very soon? And what feedback do you get from the Ethiopian government, also from the Tigrayan regional state?
The European Union, at the very beginning of this conflict, set 3 requests to be met for us as a union to be able to continue what we always desired, which is to have close partnership relations with the Federal Republic of Ethiopia. One is cessation of hostilities, including the withdrawal of Eritrean army. Second is full unhindered humanitarian access. And third is accountability for the violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. Accountability by all who committed those violations, no matter which side. We see movements on all this. And since your question relates to the first request, we noted the declaration of humanitarian truce in March, which a day after was reciprocated by the regional authorities in the form of declaration of cessation of hostilities. We hope that this will sooner, rather than later, lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities, which should be negotiated, agreed, and signed by all concerned, and that negotiations on peaceful settlement would proceed fast. European Union supports the efforts by the African Union mediation performed by former President Obasanjo. And we call upon all sides to cooperate with him. And we call upon all sides to take efforts, to take steps that would lead to the peaceful settlement of this conflict. Personally, I would like to add that after my meeting with Deputy Prime Minister yesterday and the regional president today, I do believe that it should be possible for both sides to come to an agreement soon. It is urgent that this happens. People in the region of Tigray and beyond, let's not forget some other regions, Afar and Amhara, have suffered too long and too much because of this conflict. This suffering should end, and the political leaders at regional and federal level are responsible for this to happen.
Another question?
Thank you, Your Excellency. My name is Samuel, and I'm from Ala News. My question is, why don't you visit the Amhara and the Afar environment? Some people are saying the European Union is not impartial, and the EU is supporting on the TPLF side, and there are more than 10 million people are in need of funds in Amhara and Afar. So what is your comment on this?
I categorically reject any accusation that the European Union is taking sides in this particular conflict, except one side, the side of international norms, especially international humanitarian law and international human rights law. These norms are obligatory for all those who take part, who are involved in any military conflict. That's why we are pointing to this. Now, we have not forgotten about Afar. We have not forgotten about Amhara. Maybe I will have time to visit them next time, but European Union is there. Present, our colleagues from Directorate General under my responsibility, which is Directorate General of the European Commission for Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, better known as ECHO. My colleagues regularly visit not only Tigray, but also Afar and Amhara. Moreover, the ambassadors of the European Union who serve in Ethiopia have already visited recently the Afar region and will visit tomorrow, I think, this week certainly, the Amhara region. So we have not forgotten, and that is also the fact when it comes to humanitarian assistance. Our humanitarian assistance provided by the European Union goes wherever there are humanitarian needs. Whoever is in need of humanitarian assistance is qualified for European Union humanitarian assistance. That's why we have allocated sizable portions of our humanitarian aid since the beginning of the conflict in the northern Ethiopia, also to Amhara and Afar, two people there who need humanitarian assistance.
Thank you. My name is Kasam from AMN. Do you think that there's an enabling situation in Tigray to restore that basic services? Because some Tigrayan or TPLF official announced that TPLF is ready for that other terms of war or other rounds of war. So is there an enabling situation to restore basic services?
I don't really understand your question.
Is there enabling situation to restore basic service around Tigray?
These basic services are vital for normal life of civilian population. If there is fear that, for instance, fuel would be diverted for other purposes, military purposes, this is solvable. There can be monitoring mechanisms put in place that can ensure that, for instance, fuel that is intended for hospitals, for schools, for civilian and humanitarian needs is not diverted for other purposes. So this should not be, the danger of the diversion should not be an excuse to keep a blockade on the provision of fuel. As for essential services, with this we mean electricity. With this we mean telecommunications and internet. With this we mean banking system. And I explained why it's important to restore the functioning of the banking system. Most people have sizable savings and they can't access them. And they're hungry. You see the situation? And I do not see the rationale for keeping the blockade of banking services, the blockade of electricity, and the blockade of telecommunications in this. Especially now that there is ceasefire and now there's exposed, I think that there should be early progress on the restoration of basic services.
Okay, thank you, Your Excellency. I'm Kalkidan from the Ethiopian satellite television.
Louder.
Okay, I want to ask you one question. What new thing have you found in your visit to those mentioned areas in Ethiopia beyond your knowledge you have on media outlets? For example, how can you express the situation people found in the Tigray region? I think you have explained briefly that the humanitarian aid, the basic humanitarian aid is in its enough end, but it should have to be done more. But how can you express in your own words that the situation of the people in the region?
There is a lot of suffering. There is a lot of suffering in both regions that I visited, in the Somali region of Ethiopia as well as in the Tigray region. And most of that suffering is unnecessary. It's unnecessary. When it comes to Tigray, with the restoration of essential services that I just mentioned, a lot of suffering will be over. With the lifting of restrictions on fuel and cash, a lot of unnecessary suffering will be over. And ultimately, with the peaceful settlement of this issue, all suffering in Tigray will be over. In Somali region, that suffering is a bit more delicate because it is not man-made. In that case, it is about weather. It is about the lack of rain. It is about the drought that has resulted from it. But you know, also there, we need to look for longer-term solutions. We know that these droughts have been now recurring with ever greater frequency, and this time also with greater intensity. And in view of the expected impact, or already visible impact of climate change, we can foresee that this kind of weather-related events will have even greater humanitarian impact. So there should be more focus on adaptation and resilience building of people involved. Now, a person, a family, whose only economic activity was herding animals, tending for the livestock. Now that the animals died because they couldn't find enough food for themselves, this family is left without any livelihood. What makes matters worse is that many are illiterate, have no education, so they have no other options. So they are now stuck. They are caught in a limbo where there is no solution to it. And we have to find solutions to this problem. We have to find ways to make them more resilient, to have more options for their livelihoods, not just to depend on a flock of animals, which is increasingly vulnerable to the rate of livelihood. There is a fairly big river in that region, Shevele, which can be used for irrigation and farming, for instance. This is something that we discussed with the regional authorities of the Somali region, and is, for example, one possible solution that would make the local population less vulnerable to climate change, to the impact of climate events, and would provide them greater resilience. And I would also like to mention education. Education is the surest and effective way to enable people to have more options for their livelihoods. And we will support education projects aimed at ensuring that there is universal access to education, also in regions like Somalia.
We take two last questions.
Okay, I'll ask.
Please.
I just want to ask a very quick one
You
following.
just represent locally.
Sorry, my name is Frank Carter. I'm freelance for British media. I wanted to ask a question following on from your answer about the restoration of basic services. You said that what you call the blockade of these services are necessary, and that there should be progress to resuming them. Why has there not been progress on this front, in your opinion?
This is not a question for me. I fail to see the military rationale behind the blockade of electricity, banking services, and the like. So, on the contrary, we believe that these services should be restored without delay, because they are primarily destined to civilian use, and the lack of these services aggravates the humanitarian situation in that region, as it would do in any region. And we have enough aggravating factors out there that we cannot tackle in such a simple way as restoring such basic services. I already mentioned climate events, which will be with us, and we have to adapt. But there is also another event that should not go unnoticed, and this is the Russian blockade of Ukrainian grain exports. We already see the impact of that in the market prices. The global markets have reacted, and you already see the inflation, the increase in the food prices, also here in Africa, also here in Ethiopia. This is a serious problem, which will only get worse if this blockade, Russian blockade, continues, and with those huge quantities of grain that are waiting there in the warehouses and silos, but cannot be exported if they don't find their way to their traditional destinations, which incidentally are Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, my name is Simon Patrick for Algeria. I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned that because of the conflict in Tigray, the regions of Amhara and Afar are suffering. Who do you blame? You want you to go beyond your talking points as a diplomat, and you want you to be as practical as possible. But also, you've been in the Ukraine last week, we've noticed. What's the difference between the conflicts you see in Ethiopia and the conflicts you see in the Ukraine? As a background information, the WFP head was in Ethiopia last week, and he said that it's getting worse. Next year will be even worse than this year. So in reflection, the Prime Minister has announced that Ethiopia will be in a position to send wheat, to export wheat next year. You mentioned Russia, but Ethiopia is in a position, according to the Prime Minister. How serious do you take that talking point that the Prime Minister made from the House of Commons, which he said Ethiopia will feed itself and then export outside, replacing the wheat that was coming from the Ukraine?
The fact now is Ethiopia is importing grains. The fact now also is that World Food Programme, which is the greatest humanitarian supplier of food, buys a large part of its grains from Ukraine. And the fact is also that a number of other countries, here in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, in the Sahel, in the Middle East, import much of their grain from Ukraine. And that grain is now blocked. And since it is blocked, there is also no space to store the grain that Ukrainian farmers will harvest in a couple of weeks. So it's not only the existing 20+ million tons that are not able to get to their markets, it's also twice as many tons, million tons, that are expected to be harvested and there is no place to store it because it is blockaded. This will have terrible, devastating impact in a very short run. I welcome the ambition of Ethiopian leadership to make Ethiopia self-sufficient. I think, I'm not an expert in agriculture, but I think that Ethiopia, with its soil, with its water resources, with its climate, has the potential to not only supply sufficient food for its own population, but also to export it. So I very much welcome this ambition. I think that this is also a solution for many of humanitarian situations that you have now in your country. I already mentioned the possibility of irrigation in the Somali region, but parts of it that are now affected by this drought. And it goes the same for many other places. Africa in general, in my view, should be able to produce more food for itself and depend less on imports. But these kind of things cannot happen overnight. So we are very much concerned. We as European Union, and I know that also Executive Director of the World Food Programme, Mr. Beasley, very much concerned about this short-term impact of the Russian blockade of Ukrainian exports. This is very serious. You saw that the High Representative of the European Union banded this a war crime because objectively what is happening is Russia is using food as a weapon. And this weapon is used against the most vulnerable in Africa, in the Middle East, and Central East.
So the first question, you didn't answer the first question. Who do you blame? You began by saying thank you to the Ethiopian government for giving access. We understand. But beyond the talking point, you've seen what's happening in Ethiopia, you've been to Tigray. You've said that the conflict in Tigray is really affecting other regions as well. So who do you blame? Give us a practical understanding of what you've seen because most of us can access some of these parts of the book.
It's not for me to blame any individual. And I said to you already at the beginning, the European Union is not taking sides in this particular conflict that is affecting northern Europe. But we do insist on the respect of fundamental international norms, and this respect is the responsibility of all involved. And all the violations of the international humanitarian law and international human rights law should be investigated. And if this investigation is to be credible, it's best if it is done with the participation of international independent experts. And they should investigate all sides, all places where such violations are.
But even investigations cost money. The European Union be in a position to fund it.
It will not be the first time that the European Union could do so.
But I'm looking at the past with going forward.
We should in the future. If that would be the sticking point, I'm sure the European Union would find a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.